This year, Ron Paul is turning 90 years old. It's interesting to look back and see who he lost the presidential nomination to. In 2008, it was John McCain, and in 2012, it was Mitt Romney. These two men are seen widely by Republicans to be rhinos, Republican in name only, complete sellouts. It's even okay to laugh at the thought of John McCain getting tortured when Trump says, well, I like people who weren't tortured. Mitt Romney, of course, was a Russiagator and a war hawk. These people are disdained. So, looking back, what was it about Ron Paul that made it so popular for people in the present to say Ron Paul was right about everything? Even Vice President J.D. Vance, when he was on Theo Vaughn's show, he said, I'm not a Ron Paul guy, but when it comes to the Federal Reserve, I think Ron Paul really was onto something. I was first introduced to Ron Paul in 2012. They held one of the Republican debates in Arizona. I didn't get tickets, but me and my friends watched it outside on this big projector. John King, I want to say, was the guy hosting it. He had said, describe yourself in one word. Newt Gingrich says, cheerful, and the crowd laughs hysterically. And Ron Paul said, consistent. I think this consistency is what made it so people more than a decade later really admire the work that he's done and consider the people who won the nomination, McCain and Romney, to be complete rhinos and sellouts. When it came to the Federal Reserve, for example, we would always hear that monopolies are bad and we need a big government to fight monopolies. There's just too much power in the hands of too few people. So Ron Paul wrote a book, End the Fed, where he said, yeah, this logic of monopolies. Well, the Federal Reserve is a legal monopoly created by Congress in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Those same principles he consistently applied to the Federal Reserve and just refused to have double standards. When it came to things like Sarbanes Oxley or the Patriot Act, Ron Paul was always focused on the incentives created by the legislation as opposed to the alleged intentions of the bill's sponsors or the people in Congress who claim to have the knowledge of how to make societies wealthy. Of course, that's not even close to being the truth. Ron Paul also would constantly engage in the economic way of thinking. He would not just look at the immediate effects of a bill on one group, but the long term effects of legislation on other groups in society. He also talked about the rational ignorance. So, this is the fool's errand of thinking that certain programs could just be reformed, whether it's SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, whether it's foreign aid. He would consider that if you think there's corruption in these things, it would take the voters so much time, so much energy to learn about the issue, call their congressman, get a meeting with the congressman, persuade the congressman, and the congressman's probably not even listening to you and is has his own biases and everything else. So, based on the rational ignorance principle, people are ignorant not because they're terrible people, because it takes way too much time to get informed on things and then change public opinion and then change a law, that it's much better to favor things like abolition and engage in some sort of shock therapy. Another lesson that I learned from Ron Paul is that human nature is constant. So, whether you think that members of the human race are inherently selfish or inherently altruistic, say that they're inherently selfish. Taking someone who is selfish and getting them in a position of political power does not turn a selfish person into a selfless person. To the contrary, people attracted to political power are some of the most selfish psychopaths in society. So the fact that he didn't have double standards for when it came to human nature, I thought was vitally important because many people say, well, people are bad, so therefore we need a government, which is raising the question, what species do you want running the state? Ron Paul would talk about concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, a general explanation as to why, if something is so detrimental, agricultural subsidies, sugar subsidies, foreign aid to Ukraine, Israel, or Jordan or Egypt, well, then why are we doing it? Uh, One way to look at it is, well, that people are just crazy and there's nothing to this. Or if you understand Ron Paul's principle here, it really benefits a few people to put a lot of resources because they're able to reap the benefits. Whereas the average voter it only costs them a nickel every year in their taxes. So that explains why terrible legislation is able to be prolonged for extended periods of time. Ron Paul talked about the concept of regulatory capture, that when the state chooses to regulate, they don't pick people randomly to write the legislation and tell Congress how it should be enforced. They pick people who are experts in that field who already have ties to Goldman Sachs, people like Timothy Geithner, people like Hank Paulson, people like Lloyd Austin, who were formerly with Raytheon and then became the Secretary of Defense. So this is the fool's errand of believing that the state regulating society is a way to, yield desirable results. It's also important to know Ron Paul's history. He had cited Murray and Rothbard a number of times, the economists from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And what Rothbard and Ron Paul basically have is a different definition of what government is. So President Obama said, people are afraid that government's going to take your guns. The government is us. What are you even talking about? Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard understood the state to actually be a monopoly on violence. So that drastically changes the way you interpret any ideas as to how this organization can help people. If you see them as a bunch of selfless servants, well, hey, the more power they have, the better. If you literally see them as a gang with a flag, well, then you can have all the pessimism in the world and you'll generally be on the right side of things. Can't even get that Epstein list after all this time. The final thing that I learned from Ron Paul, well, there's so many others, but he basically took the pro life position and applied it to foreign policy, where he said, look, the pro life position is it's wrong to kill innocent people. We should have that standard both domestically and with regard to people who live in different geographical areas. Here was him speaking on February 2nd of 1999. He said, "We have been bombing and occupying Iraq since 1991, longer than the occupation of Japan after World War II. Iraq has never committed aggression against the United States." He went on to say, "Our foolish policy in Iraq invites terrorist attacks against US territory and incites Islamic fundamentalism against us." This sort of common sense empathy, this consistency is why I am so appreciative to have been introduced to the work of Ron Paul. I would like to tag Dr. Bob Murphy, Representative Thomas Massey, and Comic Dave Smith to tell us their Ron Paul story.